There are 41 people on federal death row. Shannon Agofsky, Texas, 19 years on death row. A heist at the State Bank of Noel on October 6, 1989, made headlines in the little Missouri town. There was no indication of a break-in, but more than $70,000 was stolen. No alarms went off. When FBI agents arrived on the scene, they were shocked to see that the robbers had blasted rounds into a security camera and had taken many sacks of coins, a maneuver not often seen in heists. Investigators believed the offenders were amateurs rather than seasoned crooks. However, there wasn't much evidence at the site for detectives to work with. Finding bank president Dan Short, who lived alone and wasn't picking up the phone, was the detectives' first priority. Short was seen by his neighbor being kidnapped by two people and thrown into their brown van in the early hours of October 6th. The 51-year-old bank executive's safety turned into the top priority for the authorities. They eventually tracked down Short's own abandoned truck after searching the area and its back roads. The truck's bed had coins, but there were no other hints as to the missing man's location. A couple going fishing on Grand Lake, Oklahoma, then reported seeing a man's body floating in the water on October 11, 1989. The victim remained strapped with duct tape to a chair that was weighted with a block of concrete and a chain hoist, which was used to raise and lower bulky objects. In the victim's clothes, authorities discovered Dan Short's driver's license. Short's body was submerged using equipment that was flown to the FBI's forensic lab in Washington, D.C. However, 5 days following Short's robbery and kidnapping, the authorities were still at square one. A witness's tip that she had seen two men throwing something down the Cowsking Bridge helped to strengthen the case. A brown van with two colors was parked nearby. The van at Short's house matched her description of the car. Investigators located Joe Agofsky, 23 years old, and his brother Shannon, 18 years old, thanks to another tip. According to witnesses, the siblings had been boasting about their wealth and their ability to steal a significant quantity of coins. Everybody had an alibi. Joe stated he was in Joplin, Missouri, around 40 miles away with his girlfriend. According to Shannon, he was with their mother. Since there was no evidence connecting the brothers to the crimes, they were free to leave. But that all changed when a man out fishing found a duct tape fragment on which there were obvious fingerprints. With great expectations, FBI officials sent the tape to the lab in Washington, D.C. The FBI verified that the tape fragment corresponded with the tape that was fastened to Short's chair. However, none of the prints matched those in the FBI base. The absence of felony records among the suspects, according to the investigators, supported their initial suspicion that the bank heist was the work of amateurs. The chain hoist that was utilized in the crime proved crucial as the investigation went on. When a man approached, he said that the hoist was his and that he had left it behind in a rental house. The Agofsky family owned that house. Agents examined the boys' stories in detail. They discovered that Joe's older brother had misled them about his location on the day of the crimes after going through his phone records. After looking into the siblings' childhood, detectives discovered that the boys had a prosperous upbringing. When their father perished in an aircraft accident in 1980, money became a bigger necessity. According to a family acquaintance, they started running weapons in order to gain money. The friend said that Joe was the one who started it, but Shannon was glad to join in. Investigators discovered that the Agofsky brothers had been engaging in extravagant spending sprees after the Noel Bank burglary. The more the financial motivation for the crimes became apparent, the more suspicious the officials became. To prove their case, investigators required the Agofsky brothers' fingerprints. Joe complied, but Shannon refused. The prints from the older brother and the ones on the retrieved strip of duct tape matched, but not exactly. Shannon Agofsky's fingerprints were identified as being on the duct tape by officials in March 1990. The fingerprints were the smoking gun. Almost 3 years after the kidnapping, robbery, and murder, in the fall of 1992, the brothers were charged and put on trial in Missouri. Joe Agofsky, 26 at the time, and Shannon Agofsky, 21 at the time, were found guilty of conspiracy, aggravated bank robbery, and using a firearm while committing a felony, following a 7-day federal trial. They received a sentence of 5 years plus life in jail. The brothers were put on trial in an Oklahoma state court for the murder of Dan Short in 1997, following several postponements. While Joe Agofsky was not found guilty by the jury, Shannon Ogofsky was found guilty. In 2004, Shannon was sentenced to death for the murder of another prisoner in a federal facility located in Beaumont, Texas. He is incarcerated in Terre Haute, Indiana, on death row. Joe Ogofsky died March 5, 2013. Alan Billy Jerome, Missouri, 25 years on death row. Holder Norris, Missouri, 25 years on death row. A bank guard was shot and killed during a bank heist in Missouri by Billy Jerome Allen and Norris Holder. Richard Heflin, a security guard, was slain on March 17, 1997 in St. Louis, Missouri during an armed robbery at the Lindell Bank and Trust. Holder frequently did business with Lindell Bank and Trust. A legal settlement Holder received after losing the lower part of one leg in a train accident was routinely paid into his account each month for $500, and Holder withdrew the money every time. 4 days prior to the armed robbery on March 13, 1997, Holder went with Billy Jerome Allen for his regular monthly cash withdrawal. In the 10 days preceding the armed robbery, Allen and Holder were also spotted together multiple times. They viewed the films Heat and Set It Off, which showed armed bank robberies done in an assault-style takeover that was strikingly similar to the way they robbed the Lindell Bank and Trust later on. Holder was provided or he obtained a 12-gauge shotgun, 2 Russian SKS semi-automatic assault rifles, a Chinese SKS, about 200 rounds of ammunition, mostly military style, and a bulletproof vest that he wore in order to prepare for the armed robbery. Holder's mother's car was to be the third and final escape vehicle. 2 vans were taken the night before the armed robbery and used as the first 2 getaway vehicles following the robbery. Billy Jerome Allen and Holder positioned the first getaway van on the roadway just outside the bank on March 17, 1997, the day of the armed robbery. They stormed into the bank with dark ski masks and carrying extra rounds of hollow point ammunition, in addition to their semi-automatic rifles. Holder had the Russian SKS loaded with 37 rounds, and Allen had the Chinese SKS loaded with 11 rounds. The first person inside started shooting security guard Heflin right away. Holder then leaped over the counter and took money out of the teller's drawers while the robbery was going on. Both weapons were fired during the robbery according to the ballistics data, and 16 rounds were fired inside the bank, at least 8 of which struck security guard Heflin, who passed away soon after. 3 of the rounds were fired by the Russian SKS rifle, 2 were perhaps fired by either weapon, and 11 shots were fired by the Chinese SKS rifle. Within minutes of the armed robbery ending, Allen and Holder were back in the getaway vehicle, speeding away down the highway. The 2 males were seen by numerous witnesses leaving the bank and going back to the van. William Green, a bank customer, followed the vehicle onto the interstate and called 911 after hearing gunshots while at the drive-up teller window. As the van raced down the highway and into Forest Park, he kept up the pursuit. Green watched as the van caught fire as soon as it got into the park. The suspects drenched the van in gasoline before the armed robbery so that it would be simpler to erase the evidence when they got to their second getaway car. It appears that one of the suspects turned on a cigarette lighter, setting the van on fire. Allen, the passenger, leaped out of the van as it caught fire and fled into a rural area. Holder was on fire, and 2 park rangers assisted in putting out the fire. At the same time, a policeman arrived on the scene and took Holder into custody. Bobby Harris, a city forestry employee, noticed Billy Jerome Allen shortly after he exited the van on the other side of the forested area. Allen fabricated an explanation for the burning of his head hair and persuaded Harris and another forestry worker to provide him with transportation to the closest Metrolink station. Billy Jerome Allen was subsequently recognized by Harris during a lineup and trial. The following morning, Allen was taken into custody at his girlfriend's apartment, where he had spent the previous evening watching the movie Set It Off with Holder prior to the bank heist. Brandan Basham, South Carolina, 19 years on death row. Chadwick Folks, South Carolina, 19 years on death row. A native of Kentucky, Basham was serving out the last years of a term for felony forgery conviction in the Hopkins County Detention Center in Kentucky in 2002. That October, Chadwick Evan Folks was assigned to be Basham's new cellmate. Early in November, Folks was also accused with a second, more serious state offense, first-degree abuse of a child under the age of 12. Together, on November 4, 2002, Folks and Basham climbed the wall in the recreation area and fled on foot from the correctional facility. By November 5th in the evening, Basham and Folks arrived at James Hawkins' house in Hanson, Kentucky, and after approaching the residence, Basham knocked on the door and requested to use the phone. After making 2 calls, Basham informed Hawkins that his car had broken down, and Hawkins consented to take him to a convenience store nearby. Folks accompanied Hawkins and Basham as they departed the house, and the 3 men drove off in Hawkins' vehicle. The 2 men told Hawkins that their car broke down in Roberts, Kentucky. Folks instructed Hawkins to go to Indiana after informing him throughout the drive that the disabled car was actually there. Later, Folks reversed the directions once more. By then, Hawkins was being driven to their desired location by Basham, who was waving a knife at him. Eventually, Folks took over the wheel, steered the vehicle into a field, and gave Basham the order to fasten Hawkins to a tree. Folks eventually finished the task himself after getting angry with Basham's speed and tying. Wearing flip-flops, a short-sleeved vest, and shorts, they left Hawkins. After 15 hours, Hawkins managed to release himself and signaled a passing car. Later that day, when police questioned him, he revealed that Folks and Basham were the ones who had abducted him. The pair went to Portage, Indiana to see Tina Severance, one of Folks' ex-girlfriends, after leaving Hawkins. They left Hawkins' car at the motel and made their way to Severance and her friend Andrea Roddy's shared trailer. After that, the 4 took a car to a hotel in northern Indiana, where they spent the following few days. Roddy and Basham eventually started a relationship. While in Indiana, Folks asked Severance if she knew of anyone who could provide him with guns. After telling Folks that one of her friends, Robert Talsma, kept multiple guns at his residence, Severance and Roddy decided to lure Talsma to head out by offering to buy him breakfast. Basham and Folks broke into Talsma's house while he was having breakfast with the women, taking 4 guns, a ring, and multiple blank checks. After that, they met up with Severance and Roddy again, and the 4 of them drove to Sturgis, Michigan in Severance's van. On November 8th, Folks and Severance went to Goshen, Indiana to use Mary Jane and methamphetamines with Folks' brother, Ronnie Folks. Basham and Roddy stayed at a hotel in Sturgis that night. During the night, 2 policemen started pounding on doors at the Sturgis hotel where Basham and Roddy were sleeping. After opening his door and noticing the officers, Basham slammed it, and he pulled out a .22 caliber handgun he had stolen from Talsma. Ultimately, the officers left before they could get to Basham's door. Nevertheless, Basham told Roddy that he was willing to shoot the cops. To buy some random items, Basham and Roddy traveled to a nearby Kmart early on November 9. After meeting 3 teenagers in the parking lot, Basham told Roddy he wanted to kill them because they had some money. Using some of the stolen checks, Basham bought some snacks and then invited the teens back to the hotel room. Shortly afterwards, Severance and Folks returned to the hotel and the teens departed. Then, Severance's van was driven by Folks, Basham, Roddy, and Severance to Goshen, Indiana, residence of Folks' brother, Ronnie Folks. The 4 of them took Severance's van and headed to Picketon, Ohio on November 10, 2002. Again, Basham bought miscellaneous items using stolen checks, which Roddy then gave back for cash. In addition, Folks stole a cell phone and pocketbook from a Walmart parking lot, and Basham and Folks purchased 2 sets of camouflage clothes. They chose a motel room in Kenova, West Virginia, which is close to Huntington, on November 11. Dressed in their camouflage outfits, Folks and Basham departed the hotel room on their own and did not return until early on November 12. 19-year-old Samantha Burns, a student at Marshall University, was employed at the Huntington Mall J.C. Penney's shop. Burns additionally sold candy boxes, which she kept in her van as part of a school fundraiser. Burns and her aunt met on November 11 at Penney's to buy clothes for one of Burns's nieces. They parked in different parts of the mall. Burns informed her mother over the phone at 9:46 p.m. that night that she would be spending the night at a friend's house. Since then, she disappeared. A local fire crew was called to a reported explosion and fire at a remote area 3 miles outside of Huntington on November 12, 2002, early in the morning. At the cemetery, the responding firefighters discovered a burned-out automobile that was subsequently recognized as Burns's. Folks revealed that he had stolen some cash when he and Basham arrived back to the motel with dirty clothes. The four of them left the motel later that morning and headed to South Carolina, where Folks had spent a number of years throughout the 1990s. Some details surfaced that connected Folks and Basham to Burns's abduction. In the van, Roddy and Severance claimed to have seen mud and one of Burns's candy boxes. Basham began wearing Samantha Burns's heart-shaped necklace around his neck. Basham admitted to the women that he had taken the ring from a car and the candy from a girl who was selling it. Along with other things, Roddy also discovered Burns's picture ID thrown out. Furthermore, it was later discovered that Folks made 2 ATM withdrawals from nearby banks on November 11 using Burns's card. Folks, Basham, Severance, and Roddy arrived at a motel in Little River, South Carolina on November 12. The following day was a day of relative relaxation. Folks and Basham went shopping, swiped wallets and handbags from unattended cars, and came back to the motel room to drink, smoke, and play cards. The four relocated to a motel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on November 14. After leaving the women, Folks and Basham headed to Conway, South Carolina. The pair broke into Sam Jordan's Conway house with the intention of stealing guns. Sam's father, Carl Jordan, arrived at the house just as Folks and Basham were heading out. Folks made an effort to crash Severance's van with Jordan's car, but he was unsuccessful. Basham left the house and fired a shot into a neighboring greenhouse. Jordan's car window was damaged by a bullet fired by Folks. Jordan left the area while Folks and Basham pursued him while continuing to fire. After a while, Folks and Basham gave up chasing Severance's van and stole a vehicle, which they then took to the Conway Walmart. When Basham arrived at the Walmart, he went up to a blue BMW car that Alice Donovan, 44 years old, was driving. Folks was waiting at the back of the parking lot when Donovan was forced to drive by Basham, who got into the car. There, Folks got into the driver's seat and took off. At 4:03 p.m., Folks went to a gas station and paid with Donovan's ATM card. Donovan called her daughter about 4:30 p.m. to let her know she would be arriving home late from shopping. Later that day, a number of men from the B3 Farms Hunt Club saw a BMW driven by 2 men and a woman pull to the end of a road near the lodge, turn, and drive away. Like Burns, Donovan disappeared. Afterwards, when Folks and Basham got back to their Myrtle Beach motel, they informed Severance and Roddy that they had to leave town because Severance's van had been seized and Basham had shot at some police officers. Basham and Folks left Severance and Roddy behind at Myrtle Beach and got into Donovan's BMW, heading towards West Virginia. In Little River, Myrtle Beach, and Raleigh, North Carolina, Donovan's ATM card was used. In the meantime, Severance claimed that her van had been stolen and filed a false police report. Folks and Basham arrived at Beth McGuffin's house near Huntington, West Virginia on November 15, 2002. Folks' childhood friend McGuffin consented to let Folks and Basham to stay at her house. Basham was presented to her by Folks as Tommy Blake. On November 15, Folks and Basham bought crack cocaine later on to split amongst them. In addition, Basham and McGuffin started dating. Basham gifted Burns's heart-shaped ring to McGuffin. The three of them watched a news report on November 16 on Samantha Burns's disappearance. When McGuffin remarked that Burns was likely dead, Folks stated, "She is dead." The FBI was looking into the kidnapping of James Hawkins as they thought Folks and Brandan Basham had done it after breaking out of jail. The FBI was informed that Severance had reported her van stolen and that the two guys may be in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. When the FBI and local officials spoke with Severance on November 16, they discovered that Folks and Basham had left the area. When Alice and Donovan vanished, the FBI also learned about it and began to suspect Folks and Basham. After smoking Mary Jane together on Sunday, November 17, Folks and Basham told McGuffin they were going to Arizona and left her home. Instead, they made a stop around 20 minutes outside Huntington in the Ashland Mall in Ashland, Kentucky. At some point throughout the evening, Basham approached the 15-year-old daughter of Deanna Francis as she got into the passenger side of their car in a Walmart parking lot. After attempting to get inside the car and pointing a gun at the adolescent, Basham requested for directions to Greenville, Kentucky. Basham observed that Deanna's daughter was talking on her phone, so he turned to leave, saying, "My bad, I didn't mean to scare you." Deanna called 911 right away. When Ashland police officer Matt Davis learned of the attempted carjacking from dispatch, he was about 4 blocks away from the Ashland Mall. After driving to the mall, Davis noticed Brandan Basham, who fit the description of the person he thought would be the carjacker. As soon as Davis got out of his patrol car and got close to Basham, Basham started to run. Drawing his gun, Basham fired a warning shot into the air as Davis pursued him through the shopping center. Basham grabbed his firearm again as the pursuit went on, turned and fired at Davis, who returned fire with 3 shots of his own. Eventually, Basham found his hiding place in a rail yard near the Ohio River. After Davis asked for reinforcements, the location was surrounded. Over an hour later, at roughly 9 o'clock at night, Basham turned himself in to the authorities and gave his name as Josh Rittman. Authorities discovered the crack cocaine pipe and the knife on Basham's person that were subsequently determined to belong to Alice Donovan. It was several days later when Basham's weapon was found inside the train car. That night, folks went back to McGuffin's house and watched a news clip about Basham's apprehension. On November 18 in the morning, folks departed from McGuffin's home and drove Donovan's BMW to his brother's home in Goshen, Indiana. After folks pulled over at a rest area, an Ohio State trooper approached him after determining that the BMW was stolen. This led to an extremely fast chase that reached speeds of over 130 miles per hour. Folks almost hit another trooper during this pursuit, but he was able to get away and escape capture. Eventually, in the morning hours of November 20th, Folks reached his brother's house. However, Folks was detained when he drove to a barn with his brother Ronnie and Ronnie's girlfriend to hide the BMW since police were watching Ronnie's house. Later on, the bodily fluids of an unnamed female and Folks' semen were discovered in the rear seat of the BMW. Investigators in West Virginia discovered that Josh Rittman was actually Brandan Basham. On November 19 at 2 a.m., Basham had his first interview. When investigators initially spoke with him, he said that he and Folks had broken out of prison and committed felonies in the process. Afterwards, he acknowledged that they had gone to Conway, South Carolina, and abducted a woman there, but Basham maintained that the woman was still alive and with Folks. On November 19, around 9:45 a.m., Basham was interviewed again by investigators. Investigators were told by Basham and Folks that they had abducted a man after fleeing from prison and that they had guns with them when they abducted Donovan. He also revealed to detectives that they had driven Donovan to Ashland, Kentucky, and that Folks was waiting for Basham when he was apprehended. They had also used her credit cards to collect cash. This time, Basham claimed that because Donovan was not with him and Folks at the Ashland Mall, he believed she had passed away. Basham allegedly informed investigators that Folks got a girl in West Virginia during this interview. Brandan Basham was interviewed by FBI investigators for 7 hours on November 20th. This time, Basham informed detectives that after they had taken Donovan hostage, Folks had driven Donovan to a remote location where he essayed her, bound her, and then abandoned her. Furthermore, Folks was the one who, according to Basham, really carjacked Donovan. In addition, Basham made it clear that by saying that Folks got a girl in West Virginia, he meant that they had taken credit cards from a girl, not that they had abducted other people. Investigators thought Donovan might still be alive at this point. Basham sketched out a map of the locations that he and Folks had visited with Donovan. Despite a 2-day investigation, police officers were unable to find any evidence of Donovan's whereabouts. On November 25, Basham, who was now under legal representation, agreed to help detectives locate Donovan's body once more. He showed the detectives a map that indicated going through a cemetery and said that Donovan's body was found in the woods, covered but not buried. There were no particular landmarks that Basham could point out to help the investigators. Through legal counsel, Brandan Basham notified the investigators on November 26 that Samantha Burns had passed away and that he and Folks had tossed her body into the river near Huntington by rolling it down an embankment. A search team was assembled by the FBI and state authorities 2 days later, on November 28, to look for Donovan's body in Brunswick County, North Carolina. Basham informed the detectives that he and Folks had passed the park, removed Donovan's body from the vehicle, hauled it into the forest, and covered it. Twice, when he pointed out locations where he and Folks had taken Donovan, Basham broke down in tears. Subsequently, Basham admitted to the detectives that he had discarded a purse strap belonging to Liz Claiborne at the Beatree Farms Cemetery. There was no success in searching the cemetery. While incarcerated pending trial, Brandan Basham started sending letters to McGuffin in late November 2002. In these letters, he revealed his true identity, declared his love for her, denied having hurt that girl from South Carolina, and blamed Folks for their criminal spree. Basham said that Folks had lied to him. He also lied to McGuffin, saying that the ring he gave her as a present was not stolen. Aquilia Barnett, North Carolina, 25 years on death row. For the killings of Donald Lee Allen and Robin Williams, he received the death penalty. In 1994, Barnett and Miss Williams started dating. In March 1995, the two moved into a shared residence in Roanoke, Virginia. Their relationship deteriorated a little more than a year later, and Miss Williams split from Barnett in April 1996. Subsequently, Barnett moved out of their shared residence in Roanoke and went back to live in his mother's home in Charlotte, North Carolina. The breakup was not amicable, however, and Barnett continued to attempt to resume their relationship. Miss Williams was afraid to live in her apartment alone, so a friend, Benjamin Green, was staying with her. Miss Williams had continued to reside in the apartment she had shared with Barnett. When she woke Green up on April 30th, 1996, she said, "He was here," alluding to Barnett. Gazing through the window, Green witnessed Barnett using a baseball bat to smash the windows of his vehicle. When Green tried to dial 911, the phone lines were severed. Barnett started bashing at the glass with the bat after noticing Miss Williams inside the apartment. The flat caught fire when he launched a firebomb through a hole he had forced open in the front door. Green opened fire on Barnett, who then ran from the scene. Miss Williams and Green managed to escape the fire by climbing out of a back window. She suffered second and third-degree burns to her hands and arms. She had to be hospitalized. The Roanoke police received information on Barnett from Miss Williams, and they promptly filed a warrant for his arrest and alerted the Charlotte Police Department, but Barnett was not taken into custody by the Charlotte police. On May 20th, 1996, Barnett used his brother Mario Vonnegut Barnett's Virginia driver's license to buy a 12-gauge shotgun in Charlotte. The following day, he gave the rifle back and traded it in for a semi-automatic shotgun. Barnett left his mother's home on June 21, 1996, and made his way to the adjacent crossroads of Morrisfield Road and Billy Graham Parkway. It was just after midnight when Donald Allen pulled onto the crossroads in his blue Honda Prelude. Barnett pulled up to Allen's car, brandishing the shotgun, and told him to get out. When Barnett insisted that Allen put down his wallet, Allen obliged as well. Then Barnett made Allen walk across the road to a drainage ditch. He entered the ditch, shot Allen 3 times in the back, and then dumped his body there. Barnett grabbed Allen's money and the car, then headed to the Roanoke, Virginia home of Robin Williams's mother, Bertha Williams. Since the firebombing, Miss Williams had been living with her mother. When Barnett got to Mrs. Williams's house, he severed the phone wires in the backyard. Then, realizing that the side kitchen door was shut, he tried to enter the house through it and kicked it in after firing his gun into it. When Barnett arrived, Mrs. Williams was inside the house with her 8-month-old grandchild. Miss Williams fled out the front door once Mrs. Williams gave her the order to do so. Barnett went inside, accosted Mrs. Williams, and pursued Miss Williams across the street as she left the home through the front door. Barnett raced by Sonji Hill, a neighbor, who was waiting in the doorway phoning the police. While trying to escape from Barnett, Miss Williams stumbled and she fell. Barnett pulled her by the hair back to her mother's house. He revealed to Miss Williams that he intended to murder both her and himself. When they got back to the house, Mrs. Williams emerged and Miss Williams broke free from Barnett to follow her mother in the direction of the house. Barnett then shot Miss Williams twice. He fired the opening shot, striking Miss Williams in the side from a distance of 10 to 12 feet. The second shot struck her in the back from 4 or 5 feet away. Mrs. Williams was close enough to her daughter to touch her when Barnett fired both rounds. These wounds proved fatal for Miss Williams. Barnett took Allen's car after leaving the murder site, and he drove to Knoxville, Tennessee. He even stole fresh license plates for it. After that, on June 24, 1996, he left the car in a parking lot of a retail mall in Charlotte, North Carolina. That evening, police officers found the vehicle, and in a nearby garbage, they discovered the gun Barnett had used in the murders. On June 25, 1996, Barnett went to his mother's house to turn himself in to the police. Following his apprehension, Barnett led the police to the scene of Allen's murder and showed them where to locate the body. Barnett admitted to the two killings and the carjacking. Kenneth Eugene Barrett, Oklahoma, 18 years on death row. A federal jury in Oklahoma recommended on November 18, 2005, that Barrett be sentenced to death for the September 24, 1999 murder of David Eels, a police officer. The deliberate assassination of a state law enforcement officer during a narcotics offense and while the officer was carrying out his official responsibilities was the reason for the death penalty. Another police officer was also hurt. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit overturned Barrett's death sentence on January 19, 2021, due to inadequate legal representation during the penalty phase of the trial. His final sentence is still pending. Anthony Battle, Georgia, 26 years on death row. Battle murdered and essayed his wife, a serving Marine, in 1987 after breaking into the Marine base at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. He received a life sentence. After a few moves, Battle was finally relocated in 1993 to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. D'Antonio Washington, a correctional officer, was discovered bleeding profusely from his head while laying on the floor on December 21, 1994. Employees of the prison raced to the area and discovered Battle standing close to a nearby vending machine. Blood spattered on his clothes. Behind the vending machine, a hammer with fresh blood, later identified as Officer Washington's blood, was discovered. Anthony Battle needed the hammer to fix something in his cell, so Richard Boone, a prisoner who was permitted to carry tools, lent it to him. Medical examiners subsequently testified that 3 powerful hits to the head with a hammer were the cause of Officer Washington's death. According to Battle, he chose to strike the first correctional officer he spotted after grabbing the hammer. Robert Bowers, Pennsylvania, less than a year on death row. When Bowers broke into the Tree of Life synagogue on October 27, 2018, he defiled the house of worship by shooting everyone he could find with an AR-15 rifle. 11 people died that day. Another 7 people were wounded, including 5 police officers. Bowers repeatedly expressed his contempt of Jews on social media, and he also maintained his pride in having killed Jews. The legal team for Bowers has argued that their client suffers from schizophrenia, and that Bowers' attack on the synagogue was motivated by a mistaken notion that Jews were complicit in the genocide of white people. Mayor Jason Brown, Georgia, 20 years on death row. For the murder of a U.S. postal worker, Brown received the death penalty. The murder happened as part of a $1,175 money order heist at a post office in Fleming, Georgia. Postmistress Sally Gallia attempted to defend herself as the robbery took place, but Brown stabbed her 10 times before abandoning her to die alone and face down on the ground. Carlos Caro, Virginia, 16 years on death row. On December 17, 2003, at approximately 6:40 p.m., a prison guard at United States Penitentiary Lee in Jonesville, Virginia's Special Housing Unit, discovered that inmate Roberto Sandoval had been strangled to death inside his cell. His neck was wrapped with a towel. There had been no one else in the closed cell apart from his cellmate, Caro. Wesley Coons, Missouri, 9 years on death row. Charles Hall, Missouri, 9 years on death row. At the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, Charles Hall and Wesley Coons were found guilty of killing a fellow prisoner and given the death penalty. In court records, Coons was given a life sentence for a carjacking that resulted in a lady being essayed. Hall was facing a sentence for making threats against the federal prosecutor and judge. Victor Castro Rodriguez was the victim. He was beaten to death for allegedly assisting a guard in need who was being attacked by a fellow prisoner. Rodriguez, 51 years old, was found dead on the floor of his cell on January 26, 2010. Odell Corley, Indiana, 19 years on death row. On October 27, 2004, Corley was found guilty on several offenses, including capital murder and bank robbery, and he was given the death penalty. The convictions resulted from Corley's and other people's conduct on August 27, 2002, when they robbed a bank, killing 2 people and crippling a third. Corley, along with 4 other people, namely Edward Johnson, Andre McGregor, Danius Gay, and Gina Ramsey, were all part of the prearranged robbery attempt. Brandan Council, South Carolina, 4 years on death row. In Conway, a small city north of Myrtle Beach, Council was found guilty of killing Donna Major and Katie Skeen during an armed robbery at Crescom Bank. On August 21, 2017, in the afternoon, the man from North Carolina entered the bank branch and approached Major, the loan teller, with a weapon concealed beneath his shirt. Following the 59-year-old woman's shooting, Council fled into an adjacent office and discovered Skeen hiding behind her desk. Skeen, who was 36, was shot twice by him, once in the head. According to documents, he shot Major in the head after robbing the bank of $15,000 in cash. Council was taken into custody after 2 days. He said that he had shot the women to prevent them from raising the alarm. In addition, he made a number of odd claims concerning mind control, demons, and soldiers. Christopher Kramer, Texas, 5 years on death row. Ricky Fackrell, Texas, 5 years on death row. The death penalty was imposed on 2 federal prisoners who were found guilty of murdering another prisoner in Beaumont Prison in the Eastern District of Texas. On March 3, 2016, a federal grand jury indicted Ricky Fackrell and Christopher Kramer on charges of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On May 9, a federal jury found them both guilty of first-degree murder after a 6-day trial presided over by U.S. District Judge Marcia Crone. They both plotted to kill another prisoner named Leo Johns. Johns was fatally stabbed on June 9, 2014, inside the federal penitentiary. The 3 prisoners belonged to the white supremacist organization, Soldiers of the Aryan Culture. Len Davis, Louisiana, 18 years on death row. In April 1996, Davis, a New Orleans police officer involved in a narcotics conspiracy case, was found guilty on 2 counts and given the death penalty for ordering the murder of a young woman who had witnessed him assault a witness in a separate incident. Paul Hardy, a co-defendant, was the one who pulled the trigger on the murder. In May 1996, Hardy was also given the death penalty for 2 convictions. The sentences and one of each defendant's 2 capital convictions were overturned by the Fifth Circuit. For both offenders, the judge mandated a second sentencing hearing. On August 9, 2005, a federal jury once more recommended that Len Davis be executed. Hardy is not facing the death penalty. Joseph Abron, Texas, 14 years on death row. A jury found Abron guilty on May 11, 2009 of killing Keith Davis in 2005 when he was incarcerated in a federal facility in Beaumont, Texas. On May 18th, the district court judge condemned Abron as per the jury's recommendation. It was claimed that the defendant and the victim belonged to a gang in Washington, D.C. Since he was 15 years old, Abron has spent most of his life behind bars. Edward Fields, Oklahoma, 18 years on death row. On July 22, 2005, Fields, a former prison guard, received a death sentence recommendation from a jury in Oklahoma's Eastern District. Fields entered a guilty plea to the murder of 2 campers in the Ouachita National Forest wearing his makeshift sniper gear. There was some proof that Fields suffered from mental illness. On November 8, 2005, a federal judge sentenced him to death. Marvin Gabriel, Michigan, 21 years on death row. Gabriel was given the death penalty on March 16, 2002 for a homicide that occurred in Michigan's Manistee National Forest in 1997. He was sentenced under the federal system since the victim was slain on federal land, even though Michigan does not have the death penalty. In his case, a federal death sentence was imposed in a state that had not approved the death penalty on its own, marking the first instance of this kind of action since the federal death penalty was brought back. A panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit reversed Gabriel's death sentence because the trial judge had not given the defense the opportunity to present the argument that Gabriel would not have received the death penalty had he been tried in a Michigan state court. After reviewing the ruling, the Sixth Circuit overturned the panel in May 2013. His attorneys then submitted a writ of habeas corpus petition. In a complaint filed in January 2017, it was claimed that Gabriel lacked mental capacity and described his lengthy history of serious mental illness, which may have worsened during the past years while he was detained on death row. Edgar Garcia, Texas, 13 years on death row. Mark Snar, Texas, 13 years on death row. These two federal prison convicts were recommended the death sentence by a Beaumont, Texas jury on May 24, 2010 for the murder of their fellow inmate Gabriel Rowan. In addition, they stabbed two prison officers, injuring them. On May 7, 2010, they were found guilty of the murder that took place at the Beaumont U.S. Penitentiary. Both prisoners were serving lengthy terms for trafficking illicit drugs. The FBI claims that the defendants were given a death sentence by the presiding judge that same day. Thomas Hager, Virginia, 16 years on death row. After 2 days of deliberations, a jury in Alexandria, Virginia, recommended that 34-year-old Hager be executed. This recommendation was given on November 1, 2007. Hager was found guilty of Barbara White's 1993 drug-related murder. He killed White, according to the prosecution, because she discovered the safe house he was residing at. Two of Hager's accomplices, who were also in charge of White's murder, were given life sentences and were forced to testify against him. The defendant was raised in a low-income neighborhood in southeast Washington, D.C., and his parents were drug users who mistreated and neglected their kids. Hager was sentenced to death by the judge right away. Richard Allen Jackson, North Carolina, 22 years on death row. On May 7, 2001, Jackson was found guilty in federal court of using a firearm on government land. This happened while committing a felony that claimed the victim's life. He was later given the death penalty. Jackson was found guilty on similar charges in a state court in North Carolina earlier. In 1994, he was found guilty of Karolly Styles' kidnapping and murder. Jurijus Kadamovas, California, 16 years on death row. Yuri Mikel, California, 16 years on death row. On February 13, 2007, a federal jury in Los Angeles recommended the death penalty for two men found guilty of killing Russian immigrants in a kidnapping for ransom scheme. The two individuals, according to the prosecution, abducted wealthy Russian immigrants from Los Angeles in late 2001 and early 2002 with the intention of extorting money from their friends and family. Three co-conspirators entered guilty pleas and provided testimony for the government during the trial. On March 12, 2017, the jury's death verdicts were finally enforced by the court. Daryl Lawrence, Ohio, 17 years on death row. He was found guilty on February 28, 2006 of killing Brian Hurst, a police officer, on January 6, 2005. This happened during an attempted bank heist in Columbus, Ohio. Lawrence was also found guilty of other bank robberies. On March 10, 2006, a jury recommended the death penalty. The trial judge reversed his death sentence, but in 2009, the Sixth Circuit overturned that ruling and reinstated his death penalty. Kenneth Ly, Maryland, 18 years on death row. On November 10, 2005, a federal jury in Maryland recommended that Ly be executed for the 2001 kidnapping and murder of Eric Hayes, a suspected PCP dealer and the son of a lieutenant in the D.C. Police Department. The murder was carried out in Maryland, but the kidnapping took place in Washington, D.C. James Flood, a co-defendant, was also found guilty but is expected to serve a life sentence. Lorenzo Wilson, the third defendant, was found guilty of plotting to kidnap and now faces a life sentence as well. Ronald Mikos, Illinois, 18 years on death row. A jury on May 23, 2005, recommended that the 56-year-old Chicago podiatrist be executed for the shooting murder of Joyce Brennan, a former patient, in order to keep her from testifying in a federal investigation into a Medicare fraud scheme in January 2002. A jury's recommendation for life without parole or death is legally binding on the judge in the federal system. James Rowan Jr., Virginia, 30 years on death row. Richard Tipton, Virginia, 30 years on death row. Tipton, Rowan, and Corey Johnson, their fellow defendant, belonged to an inner-city gang in Richmond, Virginia. In February 1993, they received a death sentence for their roles in many drug-related killings. The three co-defendants had scheduled execution dates for May 2006. Due to an issue with the lethal injection procedure, the executions were postponed. Johnson was put to death on January 14, 2021. Julius Robinson, Texas, 21 years on death row. On March 18, 2002, Robinson was given the death penalty for the 1999 Fort Worth, Texas killings of Rudolph Resendez in June and Juan Reyes in May. Incidents involving drugs claimed the lives of both men. On June 5, 2002, Robinson received a formal sentence from the trial judge. Dylan Roof, South Carolina, 6 years on death row. On January 10, 2017, a jury found Roof guilty of the racial killings of 9 parishioners at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and sentenced him to death. On January 11, the death penalty was formally imposed by the court. David Runyon, Virginia, 14 years on death row. A Norfolk, Virginia jury on August 27, 2009 unanimously recommended that Runyon be executed for the 2007 murder of Naval Officer Corey Allen Voss in Newport News. Former soldier Runyon was found guilty of shooting Voss as part of a murder-for-hire scheme orchestrated by Katerina Voss, Voss's wife, and Michael Draven, Katerina's boyfriend. The other 2 defendants were not prosecuted by the federal authorities to get the death penalty. After admitting guilt, Katerina Voss was given a life sentence. After being proven guilty, Draven also got a life sentence. Katerina hoped to benefit from $500,000 life insurance policy, so she hired Runyon to assassinate her husband. Ricardo Sanchez Jr., Florida, 14 years on death row. Daniel Troya, Florida, 14 years on death row. A West Palm Beach, Florida jury on March 31, 2009 recommended Troya and Sanchez get the death penalty for the 2006 murders of 2 children on the Florida Turnpike. In addition, they were found guilty of killing the parents of the children and were given life terms for that act. Every victim was of Hispanic descent. It is believed that the children's father was murdered due to a drug debt. The alleged drug operation leader was spared the death penalty. Troya and Sanchez received formal death sentences on May 13, 2009. Thomas Sanders, Louisiana, 9 years on death row. On September 26, 2014, a federal jury found Sanders guilty of kidnapping and killing a 12-year-old girl in Louisiana in 2010. The jury also sentenced Sanders to death. Earlier in Arizona, Sanders had also murdered the girl's mother. Sanders met Sue Ellen Roberts, 31, in the summer of 2010 when Roberts rented a storage unit at a Las Vegas warehouse where Sanders worked, according to evidence introduced during the trial. After Roberts and Sanders started dating, around 2 months later, Roberts decided to take Sanders to a wildlife park close to the Grand Canyon for Labor Day weekend, along with her 12-year-old daughter Lexis. After 3 days of travel, they were headed back to Nevada when Sanders pulled off Interstate 40 in a remote area of the Arizona desert, shot Sue Ellen Roberts in the head, and took Lexis Roberts hostage by forcing her into the car. Before shooting and killing Lexis Roberts in a forested area, Sanders traveled across the nation for many days. Evidence presented during the trial proved that Sanders had shot Lexis Roberts 4 times. He also slashed her throat and abandoned her body in the woods, where it was discovered on October 8, 2010 by a hunter. Following a national manhunt, Sanders was apprehended by FBI agents and the Harrison County Sheriff's deputy on November 14, 2010 at a truck stop in Gulfport, Mississippi. During the trial, Sanders' recorded confession was played for the jury, in which he acknowledged killing the mother and daughter. Caboni Savage, Pennsylvania, 10 years on death row. On May 31, 2013, a Pennsylvania jury recommended that Savage be executed for each of the 12 killings he either directed or performed between 1988 and 2004. In addition, the jury recommended that Savage be executed for retaliating against witnesses, government witnesses, their relatives, and competitors in Savage's drug operation were the murder victims. On June 3, 2013, a federal judge formally handed down 13 death sentences. Rehon Taylor, Tennessee, 15 years on death row. On October 21, 2008, a Chattanooga, Tennessee jury found Taylor guilty of murder, kidnapping, and carjacking and recommended that he be executed. Guy Locke was an Atlanta, Georgia-based businessman who was the victim. After being transported across state lines, he was killed in Tennessee. Jahar Tsarnaev, 8 years on death row. He was found guilty on 30 charges, including murder in connection with the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. In the bombing, 3 people lost their lives, hundreds were injured, and a police officer lost his life trying to capture him. On May 15, 2015, the jury returned a death verdict for one of the bombing's victims. On June 24, 2015, a formal sentence took place. The trial court's inability to interrogate jurors about the specifics of the pretrial publicity they were exposed to led to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit overturning Tsarnaev's death sentence on July 31, 2020. In a 6-3 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the decision of the appellate court. Alejandro Humana, North Carolina, 13 years on death row. A jury in Charlotte, North Carolina, on April 28, 2010, unanimously recommended Humana, who was allegedly a member of the MS-13 gang, receive the death penalty. In 2007, he was convicted of the murders of 2 Hispanic brothers at a Greensboro restaurant. In Charlotte, 26 alleged members of the MS-13 gang were indicted in 2008, including Humana. On July 27, 2010, Humana was formally given a death sentence. Hor Torres, Virginia, 9 years on death row. On April 24, 2014, a Virginia jury recommended that this former Marine, who was found guilty of killing a fellow service member in 2009, be executed. It is believed that Torres killed other people in Illinois. He gave his lawyers the order not to present any mitigating material. The judge formally sentenced Torres to death on May 30, 2014. On August 28, 2017, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit upheld his conviction and the death penalty. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.